Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's SANS webcast, Using OSINT to Defend Against Critical Infrastructure Attacks, in partnership with Dragos. My name is Carol Auth of SANS, and I will be moderating today's webcast. Today's featured speakers are Selena Larson, Dragos Cyber Threat Intelligence Analyst, and Casey Brooks, Dragos Senior Adversary Hunter. If during the webcast you have any questions for our presenters, please enter them into the questions window located on the GoToWebinar interface at any time. Please note that this webcast is being recorded, and a copy of the slides and recording of this webcast will be available for viewing later today and can be found on the SANS registration page. And with that, I'd like to hand the webcast over to our presenters.
Great. Thank you so much, Carol. Hey, everybody. Thank you so much for coming to hang out with us today. My name is Selena Larson, and I am on the Dragos Threat Intelligence team, and I'm joined by my colleague, Casey.
Hello, I am Casey Brooks, and I am a senior adversary on the Dragos Intelligence team.
So to kind of give you a little bit of an overview over what we're going to be going over today, we're going to start with OSINT overview just to kind of make sure we're all on the same page as we go through this presentation. Then we're going to discuss targeting industrial control systems and why that might be valuable for an adversary and how what type of OSINT might be referred to. And then we're going to walk through developing an open source intelligence assessment. And then finally taking action. So basically what you learned here today, what can you take back to your desk, to your office, and apply within your organization immediately. So what is open source intelligence? So it is a collection of publicly and semi-publicly available information that is used to inform multiple functions, including intelligence gathering and reporting, business and policy analysis, and adversaries hack development. So I say publicly and semi-publicly available here, and I want to point out sometimes people kind of term things differently or define things differently, and I want to point out here that we are also going to be including items that are available on the dark web via Tor browsers, not necessarily stuff that you might buy from an adversary, trying to sell data, but anything that you can get just by having a browser and going to a particular website. So Dragos focuses on open source intelligence from a cyber threat intelligence perspective, with applications from ICS asset owners, operators, and adversaries. I wanted to kind of talk about some key terms here to think about as we go through the presentation. So these terms were developed from the Carver Primer, which is a US military and DHS assessment methodology. Carver is used throughout a number of different government organizations as well, so you might be familiar with it. But to kind of talk about what we define as these sort of key terms, you have personal and personnel information. So this allows for identification of critical personnel, general personnel, or outside source personnel. That could be your contractors, third-party operators, essentially individuals that might be useful for an adversary to know about and potentially use for things like targeting for phishing operations. Criticality information refers to informing an adversary of the impact of an attack for a target's continued operations. A target's criticality is determined if its compromise or destruction has a highly significant impact in the overall organization and by its ability to conduct business operations. So effectively, the asset that an adversary might be targeting, how critical is it to the operation of a business? You can kind of think of items, for instance, like the crown jewels of an organization. That's going to vary depending on who or what the organization is. But effectively, what are the most critical components of my organization and would be interesting for an adversary? Accessibility information informs the adversary of the ability or method to remotely or physically access or egress from a target. So this could be, for instance, exposed RDP on the network that allows for initial access. But physically access is important here too, because when we're talking about industrial control systems, you have, for instance, very sensitive things at plants, safety equipment, things like that, and having sort of operators or potential threats being able to sort of physically access these targets. Recoverability information gives an adversary insight into the ability of a target's process, system, or network infrastructure to recover from an attack or compromise. So this is kind of interesting because if an adversary knows how your organization is going to respond to a cyber attack and the steps that they are going to actually take following a potential attack, then they might target more of the system, right? Like the whole process. An interesting thing to think about here, and my colleague Joe Slowick actually wrote a really great paper on it, is in the crash override attack. The adversaries targeted circuit breakers and switchgear at a transmission substation in Ukraine back in 2016, and the adversaries actually had sort of it kept in mind a sort of recoverability process that the asset owners and operators are going to take. So that's a super interesting sort of thought experiment to think about when you're talking about sort of recoverability information. Vulnerability information will inform an adversary of a vulnerability that exists in a target's infrastructure, processes, or response actions. So this can be anything from a vulnerability, for instance, all of the vulnerabilities that have been released in the last couple of months, which feels like a million, or the person that, okay, if this person gets hit by a bus and then our entire operations like have to figure out what to do because none of us know what's in this guy's head. So you have to kind of think of the vulnerabilities in the entire process, including the potential individuals that are that know everything. The effect information, so this would be information about the direct or indirect loss a target would have from an attack or compromise. Effectively, if I attack this asset or organization, what will the effect be? And then recognizability information. So this assists adversaries in identifying targets for operational gain and the level of obscurity that the target has from internal and external sources.
All right. So targeting ICS. When mapped to the ICS cyber kill chain, OSINT commonly represents stage 1 reconnaissance activity, but stage 2 information can still be identified and collected, though it is not as common as stage 1 information. It can be used to identify potential vulnerabilities, identify potential detections, implement persistent mechanisms to increase dwell time or reduce the time required to achieve objectives. Adversaries are commonly looking for information that assists them in conducting these operations. Adversaries will target industrial entities for a variety of reasons. Attacks on ICS entities like oil and gas or electric utilities, these entities that serve as critical functions within a society, can be used to further political, economic, or national security goals. Primarily, there are two distinct sets. There are nation-state related attacks, or there is cyber criminal or financial gain type attacks. Such attacks can be used for messaging purposes, retaliation with a potential impact extending to citizens of a target country's communities, or for implementing or realizing a more critical or higher importance effect and requiring a ransom or something of that nature to be paid. So giving it far greater importance. Depending on, or I'm sorry, understanding critical infrastructure can put an adversary at a tactical advantage in times of conflict or to establish a foothold to implement disruptive effects when a conflict occurs. Next slide. So in developing an OSINT assessment, you begin by identifying and prioritizing data that can be operationalized by an adversary from OSINT collection. Defenders can establish methods to reduce the availability of potentially high-risk OSINT and limit the information an adversary can utilize in a potential attack. Defenders will also be able to establish proper communication and learning processes from these assessments by identifying actionable communication requirements to address these OSINT risks. Next slide. So we begin by scoping the scenario. Defenders should begin by brainstorming multiple attack scenarios and assessing the potential risk of these attacks being conducted by an adversary. These scenarios can be developed from examples of known cyber attacks, results of tabletop exercises, and red team activities, with emphasis on scenarios developed by internal security teams that represent currently known risks. The goal of this step is to identify not only information that is useful to adversaries to utilize in offensive operations, but also to identify the potential adversaries capable of utilizing the data identified. So there is always a level of entry for some data. Some data is more complicated, some data is less complicated. It is useful to identify what known adversaries on your threat landscape can utilize the information.
So in part of scoping the scenarios, you can leverage consequence-driven security assessments to identify attacker objectives and how to combat them. So some of my colleagues here at Dragos created the crown jewel analysis model of consequence-driven ICS cybersecurity. So this scoping helps defenders visualize how an attacker may access a system to achieve a specific objective. You can see here on the right, you have this sort of reverse pyramid of from the very top of the system owner down to the crown jewels. And you can kind of see here the functional dependencies and how these can all relate. So in using this method, you can figure out what are the systems and components, what integral functions must be maintained and continued for operations to occur, how these systems, components, and their functions are at risk. And do I defend the network as a whole, or are there sort of certain network segmentations and assets that are valued higher and thus deserve a higher degree of protection? So essentially, you can kind of leverage a sort of consequence-driven, effects-driven model in order to help you sort of prioritize your defense. And that's where OSINT can come, OSINT collection and OSINT assessment can come in handy. Collaboration across the company is super important. So this would be step 2. As you're kind of putting together, collecting information, putting together your plans for conducting an assessment, you really want to consult security operators, network technicians from IT, incident response and forensics, security operators and engineering, as well as physical security specialists. These professionals can provide insight on the value of information from an adversary perspective, as well as how OSINT can enable potential attack scenarios. If you're kind of thinking, from a defender perspective or a SOC analyst perspective, and the information that you're going to be able to find available online, and the value that you think it might be, you're going to have kind of a narrow field of vision, right? So all of these folks from across your company have different experiences, different levels of insight into how these processes work and integrate with each other, as well as the information that they might seem very important for a particular process or function that you might not realize the value of. So that's why it is super important to kind of make sure that you're using a cross-company collaboration method when you are approaching these risk assessments.
Now, I know everyone is probably cringing at this slide. We've all dealt with developing network diagrams and maintaining them, but this is a critical step in assessing your OSINT risk. 1, a detailed map of the network should be developed and maintained to be able to visually describe where information is hosted, stored, and maintained. You can use this via system diagrams, flowcharts, or network maps. This does represent a common challenge for defenders in maintaining the accuracy of these network maps and system information. But it does also present an opportunity in creating communication and response processes to identify responsible organizational units, administrators, and potential problems arising from policy or regulatory requirements before an incident occurs. This is especially important in identifying, or once identified, large sources of OSINT information about who is responsible, and then the entity that is also responsible for pushing for the publication of that data. Now, this helps an organization control the data that it puts out there that can be utilized by an adversary, but it also gives defenders a good idea on quick response to resolving OSINT threat conflict or risks.
So as an example, as you're detailing a system and network, if an individual evaluates a domain hosting contractor information and third-party network access, the system being evaluated would be considered technical and contextual. This means that the content of the information hosted should be detailed to the technical specifications of the actual hosting server. So you want to make sure that you are detailing both the context of all of the pieces of equipment, assets, information, as well as the technical specifications and how these might communicate or interact and connect with each other. Step 4 would be to identify sources and collect information. So here on the right-hand side, we have a list of a bunch of different items of information that you can leverage in your intelligence gathering. And I want to point out here too that sources are going to vary for individual companies. You can use search engines, social media, job listings, which are kind of interesting and important, news websites, company websites themselves, vendor documentation and websites, financial and legal resources such as 10K filings or indictments. I want to point out here that indictments are actually a personal favorite of mine. And this last week, the US government released a number of indictments on the DOJ website, if you're interested in reading those, that provide some really interesting insight into some hacking campaigns conducted by Iranian and Chinese adversaries. Also, reconnaissance tools such as SHODA or Census can be used, online scanning engines, business solicitation portals, usernames and passwords in public repositories are dumped by adversaries, stored in GitHub. Also, too, I mentioned earlier, the sort of dark web leak sites, and specifically ransom leak sites, I think are kind of interesting in terms of OSINT data. So you can kind of consider information exposed by third-party entities that could be used in reconnaissance operations. And I mentioned the sort of ransomware data leak adversaries because we're seeing a trend with these adversaries that have been targeting industrial control systems entities, leaking vendor and contractor and potentially customer data on their websites. Not all of them are necessarily quote unquote dark web. Some of them you can access via clear text websites, but not all of the information is necessarily exclusive to the company. There will be, PII data of employees, but there's also sometimes information about a company's processes, services, vendors, things like that, that the ransomware adversary might not necessarily identify as super valuable or able to operationalize, but an adversary that is interested in sort of infiltrating or conducting an activity that's not exclusive to ransomware would find it interesting and valuable. So you want to kind of focus on this publicly available information that could be used to facilitate reconnaissance or attack development. As you're doing this, identifying your sources and collecting information, you want to kind of look inward as well. So identify security gaps in security architecture. For instance, remote login portals that lack strong passwords and multi-factor authentication. This would include RDP and VPN services. So certainly things that would likely be initial access targets for an adversary, openly available or internet accessible portals, things like that. Certainly Amazon S3 buckets, these sort of data repositories that shouldn't necessarily be exposed online. Things like that would fall into that sort of category of collecting information. And kick it back to Casey.
All right. So, conduct analysis and risk assessment. Once data is collected, analysts and defenders should determine how an adversary might operationalize that data to achieve objectives outlined in potential attack scenarios. Data should be assigned severity scores based upon the risk that that data poses to the organization, based on the matrix that we'll show you in the next slide. For instance, information that could facilitate initial access and is easily accessible to the adversary should be assigned a higher score value compared to information that does not enable an adversary to fulfill an attack objective and is difficult to obtain. The OSINT, or to enable asset owners and operators to better understand the risks that openly collected information poses to an organization, Dragos developed the OSINT collection and risk scoring matrix. With this matrix, users can quickly apply scores to identified information and the risk of an adversary operationalizing it against them. It is a quick method, though there is a little bit of analytical rigor required to prevent mirroring bias, especially in the categories of adversary utilization and how much analytical effort it requires for data to be actually operationalized. Next slide.
So to use an example, when we are applying information to the collection and risk scoring matrix. So an analyst conducts an OSINT assessment and identified a document containing engineering diagrams of an oil production facility. This document included device type and implementation information, including safety systems, and the integration of enterprise resource planning software. This document was a public vendor RFP that you were able to find in an exposed data repository. So when we are trying to assign a risk score with green being the lowest and red, being urgent and needing to be addressed, we want to think about, how important is the information and the relevance for intelligence collection from an adversary perspective, and how much effort is going to be required from an adversary to actually integrate it into its operations. So if we're looking at this example, we would identify the information of high importance and relevance for intelligence collection. The safety systems would be considered crown jewels, right? If we're kind of thinking about that crown jewel analysis, so that would be a very, very valuable piece of information, as well as an item that you would want to be extremely well defended. As well as that sort of the integration of ERP software. This could potentially provide an adversary some information in terms of how the software is integrated within OT, as well as sort of any potential enterprise or IT resources that might be communicating within the environment. And so in terms of the utilization, or how easy is it basically for an adversary to operationalize this type of information, we would consider this to be moderate to specialized analytical effort. So if you are an adversary, or if an adversary is trying to operationalize intelligence that allows them to potentially disrupt or otherwise interact with an oil production facility, certainly targeting safety instrumented systems, that's something that we saw with the Trisis adversary, right, that created malware specifically to interact with safety systems. They would require significant dwell time, likely both with the enterprise environment as well as in the OT sort of industrial environment. So you would have, already sort of the specialized effort and capabilities. But due to the document that has the implementation information, then adversary can basically learn a lot about how things work, how they can operate themselves. So that isn't necessarily highly technical, but kind of falls into that sort of moderate to specialized score. So we scored this as a 3, as you can see on the graphic on the right. And then I can kick it. Go ahead, Casey.
All right. So a way that we developed to, one, visualize this information, but also to represent it in a coherent manner that can be easily disseminated, as well as being used to develop vulnerability reporting. We created the priorities of defense and mitigation, or PODAM for short. As information is assessed and assigned scores, analysts can leverage the PODAM table, which will be in the next slide, to visualize how collected data could be operationalized by an adversary, what the value of that information is, and whether or not protections and mitigations are in place to address the potential risk. Next slide. The PODAM table for assessing OSINT collection is broken up into several main categories. We look at target identification, exploitation, infrastructure development, delivery, capabilities development, and actions on the objectives as the essentially the result of collecting specific types of information. Within these categories are descriptions of assessed potential use cases for an adversary operationalizing OSINT. For example, in target identification, OSINT information can allow them to target certain personnel, identify certain technology, or even look for organizational targets that either have a specific type of information that that an adversary wants access to, or they are responsible for a certain region or geographic location. Also, we can look at like exploitation for looking for vulnerabilities, infrastructure development to establish domain spoofs, or looking for victims to perform a legitimate compromise for access. We can also look at delivery, identifying phishing targets, as well as being able to identify or to allowing them to create legitimate looking phishing messages. There's also the potential for identifying sources or identifying possible locations for watering holes, as well as essentially looking at ways that they can deliver specific capabilities, such as a downloader or dropper via like a crafted phishing document that will be less noticeable. Now the assessed importance for identified pieces of information is designated by color, as seen in the table, with potential obstacles or known deficiencies also noted with symbols. Different characters represent the ability for an entity to mitigate the potential risk, and whether risk mitigation has issues relating to technology or policy issues. There are some times where in looking at specific technology, there's an assumption that yes, we are protected from that, but there could be a specific defense capability gap that was not taken into account based upon information that is available in OSINT. There could also be missing dependencies for identifying this information, or something that requires implementation like logging, so you can identify what pieces of information that is being hosted are heavily trafficked, if they're trafficked heavily by bots or by automated collection, as well as being able to also place identification for intelligence data, whether your intelligence vendors or your own internal intelligence groups are able to provide data about specific OSINT collection threats. And then there's also policy issues. Policy issues can be either regulatory, governmental, or possibly a organizational policy issue.
So when filling out the table, you're going to want to take the information that you gleaned from the risk matrix, essentially being able to sort of assess those colors and the severity, and then kind of map it out as you go to see where in the entire PODEM information might be best utilized. So if we're talking about vendor names and contracts, for example, an adversary might use that for targeting, infrastructure development, and exploitation. So if you kind of go along the matrix itself, you see, okay, the vendor names and contracts could provide personnel data, potentially technology, the type of technology that the organization uses, as well as organizational data in terms of potentially operationalizing that information. From a policy issue perspective, it might be kind of interesting because, as Casey kind of mentioned here, it could be a regulatory policy that entities must submit information to public sources that say, you know, these are the organizations that we're working with, these are the various vendors that we have, et cetera, et cetera. Or it could be, you know, a business policy that says, you know, these are the organizations that we are required to work with, and thus that's something that, you know, might not be able to be changed. You can kind of move through the table here, and you can see under vendor names and contracts, supply chain is marked as red. So that is obviously something that is a higher risk due to vendors and third-party integrations being something that an adversary could certainly be able to sort of weaponize or exploit. And you can see here that it has a missing dependency in that the organization is dependent on a vendor to be able to sort of have implemented security measures, and that's not necessarily something that the organization itself can control. So you can kind of fill out, as you're going through here, you can kind of think about how an adversary might sort of be able to weaponize or otherwise exploit publicly available information. And by doing so, you can actually leverage this information to say, okay, what is the highest priority item? Based on this table, you can see that the vendor names and contracts has the highest amount of red items, so that's high target importance, as well as yellow too. And so that would likely be the information that you would kind of start being able to cull and see, all right, how are we exposed and how can we improve this? Essentially making it a higher priority item. And I'll kick it to Casey for the next slide.
All right, there you go. All right, so to use a PODAM effectively, defenders and analysts are encouraged to use best practices. I know that gets said a lot, but it really is a reason why they're best practices. And to consider also future potential OSINT sources when you're looking at creating effective recommendations and resolving OSINT threats. It's recommended that defenders, one, recommend the removal of sensitive information from public sources if possible and where applicable, especially if the data that is being provided is from the analyst's own organization or an organization under control, as well as to number two, conduct thorough assessments of third-party and vendor integrations, as Selena said, within the operations environment, with emphasis on remote access and points of contact for addressing issues currently and in the future. So maintaining a good record of points of contact when you're looking at third-party connections is a very, very important piece of identifying these OSINT threats, or what other OSINT threats can be developed from that. Third, ensure third-party connections are properly secured with best practices for access restrictions, such as multi-factor authentication, segmentation, and defense in-depth measures are in place. It should also be of high importance for defenders to gain visibility and logging of these connections to monitor for anomalous or suspicious activity. Now, pushing for additional logging or additional visibility inside of an environment can sometimes be difficult, but it is also often easier to use use cases and of previous historical examples, as well as looking at what information can be gleaned from the possible OSINT OSINT information and how it can be utilized to effectively gain access via these remote access points. You should also work with vendors and contractors to identify and acknowledge maintenance and related operations in advance to determine schedules and to baseline legitimate remote activity, while also informing asset owners and operators of potential risks discovered by these assessments and your own analysis.
Once you've completed all of those steps, what do you do? How do you take action on this information? And I kind of wanted to have these steps sort of written down so all of you folks who have come to hang out with us today can actually have practical, applicable items that you can go back and start on within your own organization. So you want to implement remediation plans that focus on the most critical to least critical information for adversary operationalization. I do want to point out here too that having remediation plans isn't just useful for obviously for OSINT assessments, but also having those sort of remediation plans in place for any sort of cyber attack or leveraging cyber operations, computer network operations to have a potential effect on the organization. But when we're talking about OSINT, you're going to be creating these remediation plans as a direct result of the assessment that you have created, leveraging items like the PODEM and the risk assessment to figure out, how do you prioritize this and go from highest priority to lowest priority in terms of remediation. Plans should be documented. You want them to include realistic timelines that are required to address issues and include the entity responsible for addressing, removing, or correcting information and vulnerabilities identified. I want to kind of point out here both the realistic timelines piece as well as making people have ownership and responsibility for various items in the sort of remediation plans. I was in a former life, I was a journalist, and so deadlines are very important to me. And certainly, from an analyst perspective, and when you are sort of conducting these OSINT assessments, you can just keep collecting information. But you really want to make sure that you are establishing timelines or deadlines that say, okay, I have collected all this information. Now it's time for us to actually take action on this and figure out, how can we secure what we've already collected before moving forward to potentially identifying additional information. Also making sure that the entity responsible is aware. And this is where kind of incorporating folks from across the company is super valuable. So as you're kind of going into it, when you're kind of talking about step 2, collaboration across the company, having people sort of identify, their roles and responsibilities, and as well as kind of taking their own insight and experience to sort of being able to identify and explain how adversaries can operationalize that data. It's just as important as to kind of include them on the tail end of this too, as a sort of taking action piece, to making sure that those people whose roles and responsibilities are sort of required in order to restrict data, implement additional safeguards, add additional sort of protection, safety measures, logins, what have you, and make sure that every person is aware of their stake in the assessment. And then finally, once an assessment is complete, the results should be shared across teams. This kind of goes back to sort of collaboration across the company item, but not just, the folks who actively participated on the risk assessment and the OSINT assessment, but any sort of entity or part of the organization that might be impacted. A really great example might be human resources or public relations. So both of these parts of the business organization, both of these business units are regularly putting out information about your organization that is by design public information. So identifying potential gaps in security from that front, identifying potential operationalizational use cases for an adversary to take and exploit some of that data, and then providing them with this kind of final report that says, hey, I noticed that you posted this job description that very explicitly says what assets, vendors, and software a potential employee would be required to learn. Could we potentially restrict that a little bit? Can we have present this data in a different way? Same thing, with marketing of potentially public relations. Are they overexposing information? Is there stuff that they have been sharing or previously shared that might be able to either sort of synonymize or be able to tell the story a little bit differently? And so you really want to make sure that all of the stakeholders, including those who didn't actively participate in the assessment, are aware of the results and be able to have those sort of remediation plans in place to deal with each business unit and that exposure.
Also, to hop in there, regular assessments and reviews should also be conducted by defenders and analysts to keep not only your system maps and everything up to date, but to also provide accurate information during cybersecurity reviews, as Selena mentioned. Information from red team activity should also be collected to provide real use case examples of these OSINT assessments that can be utilized by our adversaries. It's also important to note that when developing reporting from intelligence data, that any OSINT information utilized by an adversary be taken into account and identified for timely and relevant risk mitigation. A lot of this goes back to once a defender or analyst has identified like an attack scenario assessment, being able to properly create effective messaging. So sometimes you can focus on the actual vulnerability, or you can focus on the full story of the assessment that you come up with.
Great. So that is all that we have for you guys today. I'm not sure if I'm able to view the chat window. I'm sorry. But if there are any questions, feel free to type them in there, and we will be able to either read those aloud or get to them following the presentation.
All right, thanks. So I do see a question that's come in. It says, is that supposed to be maneuver? And I'm not really sure what they mean by that. It came in a little bit before half the webcast was over. Should I ask them to clarify?
Sure, yeah, I'm so sorry. I'm not quite sure what you mean.
Are you talking about on the PODAM model during actions
yes,
and objectives? Yeah, that's maneuver.
Yeah, so they said on the PODAM slide, yeah.
Yeah, so that's probably a misspelling. And also, if you're asking like what maneuver means, it's the ability for an adversary to not only move inside of a network, but to achieve like freedom of movement through a network, such as being able to pivot from like a toehold or a foothold to gaining access to more than one user box, and as well as moving on to higher or more critical importance, such as like cyber key terrain, which is like your Active Directories or your DCs or anything like that.
All right, thanks. The next one looks like a comment. It says, I'm glad to see such an emphasis on third-party and vendor integration assessments. This often is one of the most overlooked things. You can't protect what you don't know. So as
Yes.
Yeah,
go ahead.
Yeah, sorry. So that is a great comment. A lot of times those are overlooked, or even an assumption is made that it is this third party's entities like accessing your environment, that their cybersecurity on their end of their network is secured. Now, a lot of industrial companies sometimes use small local contractors to perform operations, and they may not have large cybersecurity budgets or even have a cybersecurity presence at all. So it is very important to know like who is accessing your network, especially trusted entities, because if a trusted entity is compromised, how will you ever be able to tell if that activity or what they're doing is actually legitimate, if it is within a normal scope of hours, and also that what they're accessing is what they're supposed to be accessing, that you're maintaining the integrity of your network by ensuring that you're watching for these third-party integrations. Now, sometimes third parties aren't as like upfront or obvious, but once you conduct enough OSINT collection, you can quickly identify what contractors are available, even what potential contractors, which open up several avenues for phishing or generating specific document or weaponizing specific documents to create more effective lures based upon these third-party relationships.
All right, thanks. What is the best way to approach a third-party supply chain regulatory body regarding information shared?
Okay, so one of the best first steps is engaging counsel or any kind of body that has that can have a say in how the regulatory body requirements are developed. So a lot of times there is back and forth between governmental bodies and governmental regulatory bodies and the company itself about what information needs to be public, what information doesn't. So establishing a actual viable, like, it's not that we don't want to provide this information, it's that by providing this information and making it public, it's creating a risk to not only the business, but to the personnel who work here, and for the safety of our network. So if this information can be like edited in a certain way or obfuscated or anonymized in a certain way that it doesn't directly impact our security by presenting an obvious source of information for an adversary, is probably one of the best ways to start. And it's also better to kind of lay out the types of scenarios that are possible. And especially with governmental regulatory bodies, if you start laying out reasons why this can be, why this can impact operations, or it will have an impact on, like, in a national security sense or a economic stability sense, then a lot of times government agencies will at least initiate kind of a back and forth dialogue about adjusting what is required and what can be put publicly available. Asking to put requirements for access is also a great way to approach it, saying, like, we're going to give you this data, but we want you to be able to monitor who is accessing it, from where, and being able to ensure us that the data we're providing you, even though it's regulated, is still secured in a manner that doesn't put our business or our organization at risk.
Yeah, and I would say the same approach can be taken for vendors and more third-party folks as well. Sort of being able to conduct the assessment, identify the sort of high-risk information in the ways that it can be exploited by an adversary. You can package that to your vendors, your partners, folks as well, to sort of say, approach them in a similar fashion, and hopefully, kind of identify, if you have identified some of those dependency issues or sort of holes in the security architecture via third-party integrations as well. That's another way that you can kind of approach them and present your findings and have those conversations as well.
All right, thanks. What are the best practices to address third-party vendor assets which are being used for organization data, excuse me?
So if I understand the question correctly, a third-party asset inside of your environment, there should be adequate controls, and if not, pushing for either initial segmentation, like to prevent any kind of access or anything from that third-party connection or that third-party asset from being able to go outside of its own like required or like what is required for operation. So creating like small bubbles that essentially segregate these third-party pieces of equipment and ensuring only certain information goes out, and that an adversary can't use that to pivot into the larger environment, or an adversary cannot use that as a method of exfiltrating data going from your secured environment out through that third-party connection or piece of equipment if it's enabled to perform a outside communication.
All right, thank you. That's all the questions I see. Do you have any closing thoughts you'd like to share?
No, let's go ahead, Casey.
So I just want to say, like, while it seems daunting or not worthwhile to address OSINT because a lot of the risks come from, oh, well, we'll never be able to identify an adversary during reconnaissance. Well, that's where this becomes very important, because if you do your own assessments and identify areas that can be collected on by an adversary, as well as reviewing your own historical data, you can start getting ahead of an adversary and identifying potential risk sources ahead of actual deployment or operations conducted by an adversary from being targeted or from targeting you. That's all I have.
Yeah, no, it's great. Yeah, and we provided a lot of information. Hopefully, I know that this webinar is going to be able to be posted, so you can kind of go back and review some of that stuff. But yeah, I mean, it does, like Casey says, it does seem daunting. But if you kind of think of it from that, sort of pre-attack stage and be able to sort of identify information before an adversary has a chance to and operationalize it, it can be very, very valuable and help reduce risk across the organization. So thanks so much for having us today, and thank you for attending. And if you have any questions, Casey and I are very findable on Twitter and elsewhere on the internet, so feel free to reach out. Yeah, at Drunk Binary, at Selena Larson, and we're happy to answer questions there too.
All right, you've gotten some feedback. It says, thanks for the presentation, very valuable and great job. And we here at SANS, thank you so much, Selena and Casey, for your great presentation, and to Dragos for partnering with SANS, which helps bring this content to the SANS community. To our audience, we greatly appreciate you listening in. For a schedule of all upcoming and archived SANS webcasts, including this one, please visit sans.org/webcasts. Until next time, take care, and we hope to have you back again for the next SANS webcast.